Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. Joining me now is ForbesLife editor Michael Solomon. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. On Tuesday, Prince Harry's highly anticipated book Spare is coming out. First, before we get into all the juicy details, explain the title.
So the title comes from an old expression about royalty. When you're the king, when you're the queen, you have to have an heir and you have to have a spare, just in case something happens to the heir. In this case, Prince William is, of course, the heir, and Harry was the spare. And once Prince Charles and Diana had Prince Harry, they were done with children.
Got it. Now let's talk about the book and all the details coming out. They have been shocking. What have been some of the juiciest tidbits that we've learned so far?
So I think the thing that has shocked most people early on is this revelation that William and Harry got into a physical altercation. Harry claims that William attacked him. He says he didn't fight back. And, you know, you kind of have to take Harry at his word here, as you do with the whole book, because it isn't as salacious as people think it is. The reason it's so shocking is that the royal family doesn't talk about this. There's an old expression in the world of magic when it comes to tricks. And the expression goes like this: those who know don't tell, and those who tell don't know. And typically when you'd hear revelations about the royal family, it could be dismissed because it would be from an unnamed palace insider, and you would say, this person doesn't know. Well, when it's someone in the royal family actually telling tales, you can no longer dismiss it as this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And if you think back to the famous interview that Princess Diana did with Martin Bashir many years ago, Panorama, that was a very revelatory interview, and people couldn't believe she was lifting up the veil of the royal family. So I think that's why people think of these revelations as so shocking, because people simply don't talk when they're inside the family, or else they're ousted. I tend to think of the royal family a little bit like the mafia, that, you know, there is that vow of omerta. And if you break that vow of omerta, which is the vow of silence, you're out, you're done. You're either in witness protection, or if you're in the mafia, or in the case of Prince Harry and Meghan, you're exiled to Montecito, California, where you're under the protection of Oprah and Tyler Perry and Elton John.
That doesn't really sound like a bad place to be, but in recent interviews, Prince Harry has said he feels like he has to get this all out in the open before they can forge a relationship again with his brother and father. Do you see any coming back here?
So I don't see any coming back here from a formal royal perspective. I can't imagine that Harry will ever be a working royal again. But is that really the important question? Really, the thing that matters most, I would argue, is the family. And I think if you'd allow me to be an editor for a second, let's delete the word royal before royal family. This is a family, and they have problems. Every family has problems. They are not the only two brothers who fight. They are not the only father and son who are estranged. This is something that every family relates to. The difference is we hold the royal family to a higher standard, and we expect that they are better than we are. Why? This is a family problem that every family goes through. Every family can relate to the fact that someone doesn't like the new wife and she's not invited to Christmas, and I don't want her at grandma's funeral. Every family can relate to that. And so I think really what's happening with Harry, it's a very American way of thinking about it, but I think what's happening with Harry is Harry's going through a lot of therapy. I think Harry is going through therapy, and this book is part of his therapy. I think Harry needs to get all these feelings out. In some of the interviews he's done this week, he talked about this with Michael Strahan on Good Morning America. He talked about the fact that he's tried to discuss these things privately, and that those efforts were rebuked. And so he has now come forward in a book and said these things publicly. He is defending what he is saying publicly. He is not laying all the blame at his family's feet. He is very honest about it, saying he deserves some blame for some of the problems that are going on here. So I think the idea that Harry will be a working royal is very unlikely. The idea that Harry may make peace with his family someday, here's hoping.
Got it. So there have been very eye-opening revelations from the book, just from what has been leaked so far. Now, I want to talk about money. Do you think that this bad PR will impact the royals' family's net worth at all?
The royal family is worth some $42 billion, according to Forbes' latest estimate. Not that they have $42 billion, but King Charles controls $42 billion, of which $25 billion is really real estate. I don't see this having any impact on their money, on their finances. Harry and William were dependent on their father for their incomes. It seems strange that two men in their Harry's in his late 30s, William's in his early 40s, need to depend on their father for their income. But that's the way the family has been, and thus it will ever be. In this case, Harry now has his own income. He received $100 million from Netflix. He received a massive, massive advance, a multi-book advance for this memoir. Harry's going to be fine financially. The other family members, ironically, don't have as much money as Harry because of this. And if you think about the real historical antecedent, which is his great-grandfather, King Edward VIII. King Edward VIII abdicated his throne to marry an American divorcee. Stop me if that sounds familiar. He abdicates the throne, and Queen Elizabeth's father gets on the throne. And that starts the Windsor line that leads to Prince William and will eventually lead to Prince George.
Got it. I want to talk about Harry's net worth in more depth. So the book deal is multi-book. It's estimated to be $35 to $40 million. Is this precedented? Is that a high number, or is that par for the course?
That's an enormous book deal. That's really putting him in the category of former presidents. Simply because the British royal family doesn't do books. That's not what they do. If they do, it's a book about gardens. It's not a book that reveals anything about the family history. It's not a book that tells tales on other family members. So he was paid an enormous amount of money, and based on the early reports and based on the interviews, he's delivering on what he promised. He is telling a relatively unvarnished truth about his family, and when you have a massive book advance like that, you need to sell millions of books to pay off that advance.
And right now it's #1 on Amazon's book list, so it looks like it is paying off. But we've seen Meghan and Harry in headlines for months. We saw their 6-part docuseries late last year, as well as Spare. They have podcasts, things of that nature. Do you think that people are getting Harry and Meghan fatigue?
Depends where those people are. I think in the United Kingdom, people are pretty horrified that Prince Harry is talking about this stuff. This is not the British way, right? Stiff upper lip. We don't talk about this. That's not the way the Queen did it. That's kind of not the way Charles has done it most of his life. It is the way Diana did it, however. And for no small reason, that's part of the backlash against Harry. It's not just Meghan. It's that he's doing what his mother did. He's telling tales about his family, which is not done. So I think when it comes to the audience in the UK, I think that there is a tremendous backlash against them. I think the American audience views it somewhat differently, not the least of which because Meghan is American. So that I think there's a little sympathy there. I think Americans have a greater understanding of the sort of racism and the bigotry that Harry and Meghan are facing. I think Americans see it with a little more clear-eyed view. So I think Americans also kind of have a therapeutic view of healing and second acts and making peace and making amends that I don't necessarily know other cultures have. And so for that reason, I think an American audience is a little more sympathetic.
Do you think this amount of exposing your family members is good for their personal brands? Where do they go from here?
Well, listen, I think that Harry needs to get this out. I think it's really important for him to get out all these feelings, to get the stories out there. And in his mind, if you listen to the interviews, this is part of the healing process for him. Whether or not that happens, who can say? But for him, this is an important next step. In terms of their brand, listen, they have deals with Netflix. He can give speeches for the rest of his life. He has the Invictus Games. She can have her career too. There's talk of her doing a book now. So I'm not too worried about them from a career perspective. Again, to look at the antecedent, when Edward VIII abdicated, he was poor. He had no way of earning an income. And so he was dependent on his rich friends giving him a home to stay in for a few months here and a few months there. Harry's fine. Harry's in a mansion in California. He'll do just fine. He's sitting on a lot of money now, assuming they have smart people around them. They'll have the security they need, the protection they need. What he doesn't have is his family. And who knows what price that will take.
Got it. Well, we will definitely keep our eye out. Michael Solomon, thank you so much.
Thank you.